Good evening, ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties. This is Alex coming at you from the underworld, and welcome back to another episode of. This weekend, I'm continuing forward with my badass self, and I'm knocking out another book from the extensive TBR that I created earlier this year. Which, in this episode, I'm reviewing the novella called Wet by Dalton Primeaux. Now, before I get started, I would just like to note that I believe this book will hold some fond memories for me because I read it during a 4th of July family cookout. And as I read, I couldn't help but look over at my niece, who oddly enough was playing in a kiddie wading pool, which, due to the plot of this book, I couldn't help but giggle to myself for reasons that I'll get to in a little bit. Also, before I cracked this open, I had no idea that the book was going to be a dark comedy. And to be honest, I should have known better because the author had noted beforehand that he was a fan of trauma movies as he was growing up. But for some reason, that just didn't register to me. And it wasn't until I got to the death by Wiener scene that I realized Wet was paying its respects to those campy 80s and 90s movies that you could rent for $1 or less because they were straight to video. And since I've always loved a good bad movie, I enjoyed this book for the same reasons of why I gravitated to low budget campy horror. As a side note, I would like to add that I buddy read this with my good friend Tammy as well as my online friends Hanny and Blake. And among everyone, two of us really enjoyed the story, whereas the other two just simply felt like it wasn't their cup of tea. Nonetheless, we still had a great time discussing characters and plot. Other than that, I have some great news because if you're a fan of this book or the author, I was able to reach out to Mr. Primo, and he was kind enough to grant me some time out of his busy schedule to answer a few questions that I had about his work. So, when we come to the segment known as the story behind the story, Mr. Primo will elaborate on his inspirations and creative decisions. And of course, if he's watching or any of the friends who I buddy read this with are watching, I hope you enjoy this review. But now that we've been caught up to speed, it's time for us to dive into this review before the lazy days of summer come to an end. Wet by Dalton Primo opens up in the dead heat of summer and introduces the suburban family known as the Halls, which among them we have Jane, who is a teacher, her husband Ryan, who's a chiropractor, and their young daughter Sophia. Yet, even though at first they seem like a wholesome, happy, leave it to Beaver family, we quickly see that Sophia is anything but sugar and spice and everything nice. As the story progresses, multiple subplots emerge, one of which regards a cross country serial killer named Chester Barnes, also known as Barnes the Butcher. Which it isn't until Sophia witnesses a double homicide created by this maniac that she decides she would also like to shed some human blood. Following that crime scene, she returns home and acts like nothing ever happened. Then, once her only friend arrives, she waits until they're unsupervised, where she drowns her. From here, Sophia acts like she had no hand in her friend's death and everything was a horrible accident. Yet, even though Ryan suspects otherwise, Jane is firm in her belief that her sweet little angel could not be a monster. And although Ryan doesn't admit that he could be a contributing factor to Sophia's mental state, he and Jane decide to send her to a therapist. Meanwhile, as the Hall family doesn't quite grasp what's going on, it's revealed that Sophia and Barnes the Butcher might have more in common than what they realize. And even though Sophia's therapist says that she's well and there's nothing to worry about, Sophia's lust for more bloodshed intensifies, where she eventually creates a massacre that will haunt locals for years to come. And now we have arrived at the moment that we've all been waiting for, which this is when I finally get a chance to pick Dalton Primeaux's brain. The first question I have is, in the introduction of Wet, you mentioned that when you were younger, you enjoyed trauma movies. And after I started reading this book, I noticed where it was actually a dark comedy that felt like a love letter to independent 80s and 90s horror movies. And I was wondering, was there a specific movie that inspired this book? And what other subjects served as an inspiration?
So yeah, you hit the nail on the head. There was this overall feeling that I remember being obsessed with growing up from watching these really independent films from the 80s and 90s where it was so campy and so over the top. And it was the most gruesome scenes, but there was something so funny and I would even dare to say charming about how creative the filmmakers had to get with their low budget. They had to create these, wacky premises, wacky stories on the cheap. And I don't know, I was always impressed by it and intrigued. Trauma was a big part of my childhood because I feel like when it came to independent movies, they were the most accessible to me. Toxic Avenger obviously was so huge growing up in the 90s. And one of my older cousins showed me the Toxic Avenger when I was far too young to watch it. I think my parents would have flip their lids if they knew that he was showing that to me when I was like 5 or 6. And, it was really gory and gruesome. And I don't know, it resonated with me and it was really fun. And I felt like Wet would be the perfect story because of so many of the connections on a personal level to explore this in a literary sense.
Also, in your introduction, you had mentioned that back in the day, you had created a lot of short films with your camcorder. And among those was the short film Panic that served as the basis for the novella Wet. And even though you said that these short films are far from masterpieces, will we ever see any of them on social media?
So yes, Wet was inspired by probably my favorite home movie that I had made with my cousins at the time. They starred in most of my films. I would drag them into it, but from the age of 7 to well into my adult years, I was always behind a camera. I loved film. I just generally loved storytelling. And I don't think I ever, even though I loved writing, it was almost a quicker process to just kind of pick up a camera and film a story. So I felt myself leaning towards that. It was also just, it was a little bit more interactive with other people. So I loved bringing other people in. It felt like a group effort, an event, and it was a different type of storytelling than writing. So I really loved that growing up, and it was really fun. And the film Panic, that what is basically inspired by, it's almost the exact retelling of the story, but a little bit more depth. And it it was on social media for a while, so I did post all of my works onto YouTube, and I think there was another platform back in the day. Unfortunately, those are gone. I did put a few of them on DVD, like burn them into DVDs for I guess people that starred in them, that was their gift was the film. So those are floating out there if they still have them, but I have since removed them all from social media. And I want to say, other than those DVDs, it's kind of lost media. But if I ever get my hands on them, I may upload them. We'll see. We'll see. I think it would be really fun to revisit. But it's just, I guess, getting my hands on them. I don't know. And it might be lost media. I need to look into it.
Eventually, it's revealed that essential oils play a huge role in the plot to this book. And when this was revealed, I couldn't help but giggle at how unique and wonderfully absurd this concept was. And while this aspect of the book is obviously a jab at anti vaxxers, what was your goal for using essential oils?
So, yes, the essential oils were a huge point in the book. I did want to make it a little bit open-ended and just a tad. I didn't I wasn't trying to be overly judgmental with essential oils, but going back to trauma and Toxic Avenger, there was always some like mysterious chemical evil thing, this unhuman evil that you would find in those films. So I did kind of want to do a modern take. This was written during COVID, so like anti-vaxxers were at the forefront of my mind at the time, and I definitely don't shy away in my storytelling from being pretty candid about my feelings, my feelings to culture and commentary on society and politics. It's not hidden very well. But this was kind of my take on that like toxic sludge. And it was, like I said, it was during a time where this was at the forefront of my mind, and if you go into any of my books, you see that most of them are very personal if you dig deep enough, and this was one of them. There's so many layers to the book, but that very deep layer was me struggling with COVID at the time, what we were all living through, and some of my my opinions, but also my struggles with even people that were close to me in my life that were maybe not as receptive to my opinion. So it's definitely in there. And when you say the word jab, that's right. I love that. I don't know if you were trying to be punny, but I love that.
Wet is a part of a series called Tales Beyond the Closet, which is a collection of 6 books. Could you please elaborate on the meaning behind the name of this series and what we can expect of it as a whole?
So originally the series, I'll say the working title for the series was Don't Be a Wuss. I had this feeling, this overwhelming feeling growing up of a fear of my own emotions. And I think a lot of queer people may be able to relate to that, where it was almost seen as feminine as a man to be emotional. And I've always been extremely sensitive. Being a creative person, I've always felt most comfortable expressing my emotions. And a lot of the times I was kind of made fun of in certain situations, even reprimanded for being emotional. So when I was building this series, I wanted each book to be a personal reflection on specific emotions that I have had to deal with in the past as a queer person and become comfortable expressing, and I thought maybe other people would. So you'll see themes of just maybe disappointment, a fear of losing a loved one. If you go through each book, there's a different fear. There's fears of mental health struggles and anxiety, and it's all very personal themes, but I try to relate it in almost a humorous way. I feel like me personally, a lot of the times I deal with my struggles, my own struggles, with humor at times. And so even though most of the books, they're horror, but they're definitely like a dark comedy bent. And eventually, the feeling I felt was impressed into each of the books well enough that I could change the title, and it didn't have to be so obvious. And so eventually I was playing with different ideas of what I wanted this series to be called. And obviously there is a pun there. Being in the closet, coming out of the closet, things beyond the closet. But I also worked in fashion my whole life, and that's something that you will see in the series is there's a lot of mention to the fashion industry and my experiences in the fashion industry. And a lot of them are realistic, and they're not just realistic from a research standpoint. It was personal tales that I either witnessed or went through, and I think that's why it feels so real when talking about that industry in the books. And so there's also a pun there, or a connection to the closet in the fashion industry, where we house the clothing samples that we pull, or if you go to an editorial, a magazine, publication in the fashion industry, they'll have a closet where they house their clothes. And so there's different meanings to this word closet, and I really, I sat with it for a bit, and I knew I wanted to work that in there somewhere. It was this double meaning, being queer and in the closet and coming out of the closet. And closet's a dark place, and there's also the fashion closet. And then I don't want to spoil it, but the last book in the series, there's also another reason why we end up with that title of the closet. So it is a multifaceted title. So I'm really happy what I landed on, and I hope that people can understand and maybe pick up on some of those reasons why I call it that. But there's so many layers to each of the books and the collection as a whole, and even the title has these insane layers that I added to it. And in a way, it was just for me, but I do hope that the readers can dive in. I hope I gave them enough meat to chew on to actually dive into some of these meanings and these creative decisions that I chose because it was really fun and there was a lot of effort there.
Aside from the questions that I presented, is there anything you would like to share? Asides to the questions I had, is there anything that you would also like to share with us?
I'm really excited to share that I loved creating each of the stories separately and working through them. And this is something that I wanted to do on my own. So I never really went through a traditional publisher or an agent. It's something that I want to do in the future, but this was such a personal creative endeavor that I wanted to see what I could do on my own. And I did have a absolutely incredible editor that I worked with, Kyle Hull, and I had so much fun just us two working on this project, and he was amazing, and I feel like he understood what I was trying to do, and we kept it really fun and insanely creative, and that was really important to me. But from the start of this project, I always visualized it as one book, as a big collection, and I wanted to curate it in a really specific way. And each of the books, they are coordinated by the colors of the rainbow or the pride flag. And I did that on purpose because I wanted to curate the books based on a specific story that I wanted to tell, and also to maybe help the reader along and discovering the emotions. I think when you're curating them and you're reading them in the rainbow order, you get a different experience than if you would have read them in the order that I released them. And I really was specific about which ones I would work on when I released them, because I felt like there were maybe specific stories that I thought would be maybe more difficult to work through, and I knew they would take more time. There were some stories that I worked on at specific times because I felt connected to them based on what I was going through in my life at that time. One of the books, Warm, was very different than everything else that I had written in the series, and so I really wanted to take some time off from pretty much everything else I was working on to really focus on that, because it was a really daunting book. The tone is completely different than anything I've ever done, and I really wanted to focus on it, and it was a lot of work, and it was very hard, and it was very emotional for me too, and so I was really strategic in when I would write what, but I always had the vision of how the books would be written together, curated after writing them. And then also as a self-publisher and doing this myself, I wanted to release each story and open myself up to feedback from the readers, so that this was also a learning experience for me, and I could take into consideration a lot of the feedback and the criticism that I would get, so that moving into the next book, I could, use that and becoming a stronger writer. And, not having a team outside of me and Kyle, it was really hard to trust myself. And so I did look to the readers to give me a lot of feedback and grow. But I had always wanted the book to be a singular book. So it was almost like releasing them one at a time was my way of getting feedback. And I not only used them moving into each of the next books, but now it's released, actually. I haven't been marketing it as much as I should, but I did release the actual collection as a singular book, and I'm really excited about how it came out because when everything was done, I looked through all the feedback. I looked through the bigger picture. I curated it. I went in, and Kyle and I went through and edited the stories even further. And it's been a 4-year journey, and I definitely did it in a very strategic but unique way, I think, for a writer. And I am so proud of it, and it's exactly what I wanted and dreamt of, 4 or 5 years ago. It really, it's so great to see this now, this final product. And I'm really proud and really excited about it. But I don't know. I'm excited to see what's next too. Now I feel like almost working on this for so long, it's like it was almost this uh, uh, mission that I felt. And I think a lot of creative people and artists will understand this, but it's like almost it's a labor of love, but it still felt like something I had to do. And it's almost like a release now that it's all together and it's done. And I'm excited to see what comes of it, to see what's next for me. I feel like doing this on my own and pushing me and pushing myself. I found courage to put myself out there. I feel like I'm ready for next steps as a writer, and I don't know. It's been a really unique process, and I can ramble about this forever just because, like I said, it's a release, and I'm just like, I feel like I can finally exhale after 4 years of this overwhelming need to write. It sounds so strange, but okay, I'll stop this. This one's way too long.
And last, how can readers connect with you on social media?
People can connect with me on Goodreads. I'm definitely on Goodreads. If you read my stuff, give me feedback and reviews. I always love that. And you can find everything that I do on Amazon. All the books are there. And Instagram. So I finally made an Instagram for my books, and it's Beyond the Closet Books. So definitely can find me there. Send me notes, send me comments, anything. I'm always open to speaking to readers and other creatives. I love collaborating, so hopefully you enjoy my work and I'll be able to connect with you.
Thank you so, so, so very much for answering my questions. And I will include links to your social media in the description section of this episode. That way, if any of the viewers would like to hunt you down, they'll have easy access. But now that we have that covered, it's time to move on to the spoiler segment, which, if you haven't read this book before, I'm about to reveal some things that could ruin the experience for you. So if you would like to click away, just scroll down to the bottom and you'll see that I have a pinned comment at the top with the timestamp in it. All you have to do is click that timestamp and it will direct you away from the spoilers and bring you to the thoughts section. Now, you only have 17 seconds to do this. So, ready, set, go! Since everyone's had the opportunity to click away, I would like to talk about a few of my favorite moments. First up is the double homicide at the McCandy store. Now, leading up to this, Jane had sent Sophia down the street to purchase some tomato paste from their local grocery, which was ran by the elderly gay couple known as Randy and Beau McCandy. Once there, Sophia made some small talk, then she snuck off down one of the aisles to steal some candy. But as she was being a little klepto, Barnes the butcher ran in and held the McCandys at gunpoint. Then, as Barnes remained oblivious to being watched by Sophia, it's established that depending on the amount of time he had with his victims, he would pose their corpses in ways that would resemble grotesque topiaries or museum exhibits. Also, sometimes he would go as far as to writing in their blood messages that would identify them as sinners, demons, or lost souls who were damned to hell. Well, since Sophia is completely entertained by this, she continues to eat her candy and watch in silence. And since things are about to get nasty, when Barnes turns his back to lock up the store, Randy tries to escape by jumping over the counter. However, before he can actually clear the counter, Barnes bludgeons him with his revolver. In turn, this causes Beau to have a heart attack due to the excitement, and as Beau goes down, he hits his head on the counter, which knocks him unconscious. So instead of Barnes simply robbing them and leaving them be, he takes all of the wieners from the store's roller grill and shoves them down Randy's throat until he chokes to death. Then he shoots Beau. After that, he takes their dead bodies and moves them behind the counter, where he finally takes all of their money and flees the crime scene. Well, since Sophia is so infatuated with the violence that happened, she goes behind the counter to admire the dead bodies, and this is when she notices that Beau was shot in the crotch, and written in his blood is the F slur and the word sinners. After that, she ends up going back to her home, gives her mom the tomato paste, and acts like nothing ever happened. As I earlier mentioned, it was the death by Wieners moment that made me realize this book was a campy satire. And of course, I was all for it because I've always enjoyed how satires are so over the top and exaggerated, where even under the most serious circumstances, it feels like there needs to be a laugh track included. And this moment was no exception. But aside from the creativity of this kill and the dark humor that it provided, I was hit with mixed emotions. Because, yeah, even though it did make me giggle, I also felt uncomfortable because I felt like this particular murder was mocking and degrading Randy's sexuality. Other than what happened to Randy, it's noted that Beau was found with a bloody crotch, which I'm assuming this is because Barnes had shot him in the genitals. Aside from that, it also notes that Barnes had written in Beau's blood the F slur and the word sinners, which to me, this indicates that his actions have elevated this beyond a robbery homicide to also a hate crime. Now, before everyone thinks that Barnes only hates gay guys, the book notes that he hates everyone equally. Yet, I tend to think had this been a straight couple, I don't believe he would have sodomized one of them to death with wieners, and I highly doubt that he would have written the F slur in their blood. The next moment that stood out to me was Barnes's backstory, which at this point he had been apprehended outside of Georgia, and he explained to the authorities that his motive was to send a message to the police, specifically one that stated all of society was evil and we're all working for the devil, but in different ways. Furthermore, he elaborated that he understood the more gruesome he made his murders, the more exposure they would receive, where in turn more people would receive his message. From here, Barnes explains that when he first started, he was just having fun. But after he got addicted to drugs, he felt like everyone was damned to hell anyway. Adding on to everything, when he was a child, he had an older brother who had been drafted into Vietnam, where his older brother murdered sex workers as a pastime. Then, after his brother returned, he had shown Barnes the photos of the crimes he committed, which Barnes admits that seeing these photos messed him up. But to make matters worse, Barnes added that their parents were extremely abusive, where his mother was an ex nun who would hold his head underwater until he passed out. And whenever she would catch him drawing pictures that glorified Satan or hell, she would beat him until he bled or make him kneel on rice. Meanwhile, their father wasn't much better as he was mentally and physically abusive to everyone under the roof. Surrounding this story, Barnes reveals that his father used to work for a perfume oil factory where the workers would receive samples to bring home, which these samples would make the whole house smell and it caused Barnes to feel dizzy. Then eventually the factory had to shut down because the perfume oil that it was manufacturing had been deemed unsafe. This moment stood out to me because I quickly became invested in Barnes's backstory, which for the most part it was interesting to see how he became a serial killer due to the elements that acted against him, such as the oil samples, the hard drugs, his traumatic upbringing, and his brother's influence. Also, because of the religious trauma he suffered from his mother, it helped me understand why he was so adamant in leaving messages with his victims. Which I tend to think, had it not been for his past, he could have potentially lived a normal life. But at the same time, if he was destined to be a serial killer, had he grown up in a loving and observant household, his parents might have noticed some red flags here and gotten him the help that he needed before things got out of hand. My final favorite moment is the teenage boy massacre at the end. So, before this bloodbath goes down, it's been established that essential oils can make a person a homicidal maniac. Also, Sophia has killed her friend Kylie and has gotten away with it, and even though Ryan feels otherwise, Sophia's therapist has said everything is good and there's nothing to worry about. Well, since Sophia has gotten away with murder one time already, she's left fiending for more bloodshed. And instead of her settling for another simple drowning, she sneaks into her neighbor's backyard, where a teenage boy named Tyler has invited his friend Cole over to go swimming. And because Cole feels obligated, he lets an asinine brat named Brian tag along. Then, after everyone swims around for a little bit, Tyler and Cole go onto the porch to get some towels. And since they're out of earshot of Brian, they talk about how big of an asshole he is, which this is when they start to hear him scream. And at first, they think this is just him being nothing more than his typical self and he's playing a prank. But once they return to the pool, they find where his dead body has been tied to the pool drain with a phone cable. So, after Cole dives into the pool to try to untie the phone cord, Tyler runs inside to call for emergency. But in the process of doing so, he discovers that the phone line does not work. Then, after realizing that they're screwed, Cole runs inside at the same time that their friend Mike shows up. And despite them telling Mike that Brian's dead, he shrugs this off because he thinks they're pulling his leg and he goes upstairs to the bathroom. Meanwhile, as Tyler turns around to explain to Cole that he's going next door to call for help, he notices where Sophia has snuck inside, which, upon him seeing her, she runs further into his house. From here, Sophia goes upstairs to Mike, and once he opens the bathroom door, she charges into him, where she knocks him off his feet and he hits his head on the bathroom tile. And before he can get up, she grabs the toilet plunger, sticks it to his face, and tries to plunge him to death. Then, as the plunger remains in place, Mike bolts upright and tries to run from the bathroom. But before he can escape, he trips and falls and lands flat on his face, where the handle of the plunger goes through his head and comes out the back. And since Sophia's reign is far from being over, she leaves the bathroom, where she's confronted by Tyler. Which, at first, Tyler is apprehensive to trust her, but she does get him to lower his guard by simply sitting down to play patty cakes. But when Tyler least expects it, Sophia stabs him between the eyes with a pencil, and she does it with such force that it goes through the back of his head. Now, at this time, Cole has retrieved Brian from the pool, and while he's preoccupied with checking Brian's pulse, Sophia sneaks up from behind and binds his ankles with a phone cord that's attached to a stone based umbrella. Then, after she rolls the stone base into the pool, this leads to Cole's death. Okay, I understand some people might not feel like a girl in her single digits could kill off four teenage boys like this, but hear me out. Now, this book is a campy satire, and when you come across satires like this, you are bound to have over the top kills that are really outlandish and at times comedic. And as I read this, it brought me back to my childhood where I enjoyed movies like Slumber Party Massacre or Sleepaway Camp Part 2, or even this crappy movie that I really enjoyed called Mikey, which I'm sure no one remembers that movie, but it was a lot of fun. And I wish I had something more profound to say here, but I honestly don't. Like, yeah, I doubt a 7-year-old girl could kill off four teenage boys. It's just not realistic like this. But at the same time, the gorehound in me absolutely loved what happened, and I giggled the entire time, which makes me wonder what in the hell is wrong with me. I would like to take this opportunity to bitch about Sophia's sorry ass parents. And first up, I would like to tackle that pompous little bastard Ryan. Now, if you looked up capitalism in the dictionary, you would see this little dickweed. For starters, he was out there selling homemade essential oils when he knew damned well they were dangerous. Secondly, when his mouth breathing wife decided to use these very oils on their daughter, do you think he decided to bite the bullet and be like, "Oh, honey, I screwed up. You don't want to do that"? No, 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 no. This son of a bitch here was like, "Oh, yeah, honey, that's the good shit. Oil her down like a pig bottom at Fort Trough." Aside from him being a capitalist bastard, he blamed his wife for Kylie's death. And, I mean, he's not entirely wrong, but that doesn't give this shit for brains the right to point out the obvious at a time like this. Which, the only reason why he's so adamant in blaming his wife is because he wants to keep the spotlight off of himself. And you know what? Had he been like, "You know what, Karen? I was a total Kyle. My bad. I sold out and my actions are a contributing factor to our daughter's mental state," then I could have maybe had a smidge, just a smidge of respect for him. But no, he continued to be this egotistical, capitalistic bastard from beginning to end. He continued to gaslight and he never took any responsibility for his actions. Now, some of y'all might be like, "But Alex, he stepped up to the plate and said bullshit when Sophia's doctor said she was as right as rain." Well, pip pip, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Now, on to Jane. Jane, 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 Jane. Sweet, ignorant ass Jane. Jane is the prime example of when you have a person whose wheel is turning but the gerbil's dead. And I know I'm not a parent. Like, I have no parenting skills at all. All I have is a husband, 3 cats, and a bottle of vodka. That's it. But if I was Jane and I caught my daughter drawing some crap like this, I would have been like, "All right, you psychotic little shit. I know you didn't see this in the Care Bears movie. Where the hell did you see this from?" But no, Jane's like, "Oh, look at you. You drew a monster with some hot dogs in its mouth. I'm gonna put that on the fridge next to the picture you drew of the dead cat with angel wings." Not to mention, Sophia's teacher presented Jane with pictures that the little rugrat from hell had drawn, which was filled with nothing but blood, guts, and viscera. And what do you think Jane did? Jane was like, "Oh, you're just overreacting. My little angel is more advanced than these dumbass kids." And that's just the tip of the iceberg because, as I said, I might not be a parent, but this brain dead glue sniffer left children unattended in a swimming pool. And I don't care how well mannered these kids are or if they have floaties on their arms, if you are going to leave them in a potentially dangerous place, get their little asses out of the pool. And if they throw a shit fit, make the hellions go inside and call it a day. Aside from Jane's poor parenting skills, she is a complete whack job. And I wish I could say that the author was exaggerating here, but no. I've worked in tourism for nearly a decade, and I've met my fair share of blithering idiots. I mean, I've stared them dead in their vacant eyes and have had a void of nothingness just glare right back at me. But as far as Jane's concerned, she is such a staunch dumbass because when it's brought to her attention that her daughter is a danger to others, instead of her listening to this, she rants and raves so much that she gets all of the complaints against her little hellion dropped. Also, she was a complete anti vaxxer and a politically obsessed red waver who spouted off her unwanted opinion to any poor, unfortunate soul who could not escape her path. And again, when I worked in tourism, I came across people like this all the time where all I could do was just stand there and go, you don't say, ain't that some shit? And just hope that a damn meteor would fall out of the sky and put me out of my misery. Y'all, the parents in this book are complete morons, and because of the shit they did, I can't even blame their children all the way. Like, yeah, Barnes and Sophia should be held accountable to some degree. However, had it not been for their piss poor home life being a slap in the hairy man tits, then I think that they possibly could have had a normal life. Wet by Dalton Primeaux is a satirical horror throwback that felt like a love letter to 1980s camp. And while none of the main characters were likable, I think had they been worthy of our empathy or sympathy, this book wouldn't have been half as entertaining. Also, even though this is a quick read, the author did load us up with quite a few subjects, such as denial, capitalism, anti vaxxing, the toxic male, and the dangers of growing up in an abusive home. Character wise, I could tell Jane was trying really hard to be a carbon copy of June Cleaver, but of course she failed because that level of perfection does not exist. And at first, I thought she was going to be the tropish mother figure, which is similar to the mothers I've seen before in classics like The Good Son or The Bad Seed, where eventually they're faced with the ultimate decision. But I'm glad she didn't fall into that trope because her character provided a topic that was really interesting, and it's something that I'll get into in a little bit. Also, I really didn't care for Ryan because even though he did see the red flags that surrounded Sophia, he never said or did anything that could make the situation better. Instead, he just continued to harm his family and his clients because the almighty dollar meant more to him, which I imagine this is common when you are a money hungry narcissist. Aside from them, even though Sophia was a fun little psychopath, I feel like she served her page time, and anything more could be overkill. Now, although the ending of Wet does give wiggle room for there to be a sequel, I like to think that Sophia's just off creating her own chaos. And regardless of what she does next, I think it's rather obvious that she's gone down the same path as Barnes, which, if this is the case, I feel like she'll meet a similar fate. Theme wise, due to Jane's character, the subject of denial is a huge focus of this work. For example, even though other parents brought to Jane's attention that Sophia didn't play well with others and she was troubled, Jane continued to wear her rose tinted glasses from beginning to end. And because of this, I feel like Jane represents that demographic of parent who refuses to acknowledge that their offspring is a bully or just simply not well. Which there could be just one reason for this or multiple reasons. Out of all of the reasons why a parent might be in denial, one of those is because that parent wants to see their child as being perfect, and seeing their child under any negative light could be hurtful. Or there's the possibility that the parent is afraid of the stigma and shame that comes along with having a troubled child. But there's also the chance that the parent is dealing with their own insecurities, or it could be they simply want to protect their child's image. Otherwise, considering this book takes place in the 1980s, there is the possibility that Jane just does not realize how serious of a problem this is. Nonetheless, I do feel like Jane is one of those people who cannot deal with the fact that there's a problem under her roof. And for her, it's just simply easier to live in a fantasy land of perfection. Another subject I noticed was capitalism, which this was primarily seen by how Ryan knowingly sold toxic essential oils. And despite the damages that they caused, the money was just too good for him to stop. But to make matters worse, when his wife started using these same oils on their daughter, he didn't say anything about the dangers that could be at hand. Which this is because he was afraid if he told his wife about how toxic these oils were, she could have forced him to stop selling them. In turn, this would have cut into his extra income. And while on the subject of essential oils, this brings us to the topic of anti vaxxing. Now, I understand there's good reason to not trust the government or the FDA. I mean, look at what happened with the Tuskegee experiment. But personally, I would rather have a vaccine rather than rely on essential oils. And even though this book is a satire that brings the dangers of essential oils up to a South Park level, I had no idea how dangerous some of these essential oils could be until I Googled them. And what really blew my mind was the fact that some people think it's okay to ingest essential oils, which that is a bad idea. Like, it is dangerous to ingest essential oils. So if you know of someone who's like, oh yeah, you should do it, no, don't. That is a bad idea. It is dangerous. It could kill you. Don't do it. Also, since anti vaxxing is not seen in a positive light due to what happens to the characters, if you're an anti vaxxer, I don't think this is going to be the book for you. And with that said, yeah, the characters do encounter some very over the top scenarios because of their choices to use essential oils. Even still, the author does utilize this opportunity to point out the dangers of not getting vaccinated. Which, because of this subject being as serious as what it is, I think that's why he decided to make this book a satirical dark comedy. Following that is the subject of the toxic male, which this is primarily seen by how Ryan gaslights Jane, and he refuses to also take responsibility in regards to what's happening with Sophia. For example, after one of Sophia's friends was murdered, he was very relentless on blaming Jane for everything just to deflect from himself. Other than him, Barnes was very self righteous and egotistical, especially since he felt like it was necessary to point out another person's sins, despite the fact that he was committing the ultimate sin. Which I feel like his actions were the results of all of these horrible elements coming together to build a perfect storm. And among some of those elements, I would definitely include religious trauma and an abusive upbringing. And last is the subject of an abusive home life. Now, with that in mind, I feel like the author constructed Sophia and Barnes to have similarities and differences. Like, as far as similarities are concerned, yeah, they killed people and they were affected by toxic oils. But I also feel like they grew up in abusive settings. Even though they had two completely different experiences, there was still a level of neglect that they both endured. On one hand, we have Barnes, who grew up in a setting where he was physically and mentally abused. And adding on to the monster he became, his brother enabled his toxic behavior towards women, and they went down a path of drug abuse and hedonism. So, with that in mind, Barnes never received the help he needed to become a better person. Then, on the other hand, we have Sophia's life, where her parents are normally arguing and they're just really dismissive of what's going on in her life. And even though her father sees the red flags a little bit more than her mother does, he never really speaks out to get her the help that she needs because he's too concerned about money. And this is all nothing but an injustice to her because even though she is going through this right now, there is the potential that she could easily become a better or more stable person if she had the help she needed. But instead, she remains neglected. With that said, I feel like this book could easily be a cautionary tale that warns people to put aside their essential oils and go get vaccinated. But at the same time, I feel like it could be a cautionary tale for parents that warns them to pay greater attention to their children, especially when it comes down to the red flags. Overall, Wet didn't gross me out, scare me, or creep me out, but it did keep me entertained, and there were a few times that I did laugh, even though I probably shouldn't have. Wet by Dalton Primeaux not only provided me with the escapism I needed, but I was able to read this in just a couple of hours while I spent time with my family. And even though not everyone in our buddy group felt like this was their cup of tea, I believe that the book achieved what it set out to do, which was to present the subjects that I discussed and to do it in a comedic way. So, at the end of the day, if you are looking for a super short, entertaining book that could kill a few hours while you're sunbathing, then I do highly recommend Wet. Now that we're at the end of this video, I would like to thank these amazing people for contributing to my Patreon account. As you can tell, some of the names listed here are creators, so be sure to check out their work. And if you would like to contribute to my Patreon account, I have a link available in the description section of this episode, where for $5 a month, I'll give you a shout out at the end of my videos. And if there is a certain profession you would like for me to tie to your name, just let me know and I'll do that. Also, I do have a $10 tier available where for $10 a month, I'll still give you the shout out as you see here, but I do creepy photography on the side, so at the beginning of every month, I send out one of my creepy photos. From there, you can print it off and do whatever you like with it. So if you're able to do this, that's awesome. If not, no sweat. I just hope you return to this channel so we can continue to have a good time together. Also, if you would like to hit me up on social media, links to my Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Threads are all available in the description section of this episode. And if you've not subscribed to this channel, be sure to subscribe and click that notifications bell as I have more book reviews coming in the near future. So until we see each other again, I hope you have a great week and sweet nightmares.